We talked earlier today so much about more big digital, talked about overall journeys, overall processes. Today, we're going to zero in now in this next session for making every touch point count to build better client relationships. We're going to talk a little bit more B2B this time and how you can really zero in. So joining me today is Miranda and Zikowski. Did I say that right? I forgot to ask you how to pronounce it.
That's okay. Miranda Dikonsky. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Swiftly.
Yes.
Ryan Mascarenhas. Mascarenhas, okay. With bolttech and Caroline Cathcart. I did ask you, Caroline, how to pronounce it. With RPIA Investment Advisors. So I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourselves, and then we'll hop into the questions. And so I'm going to start. Let's go with Ryan, Caroline, and then Miranda.
Perfect. So Ryan Mascarenhas, I'm the Group Chief Customer Officer at bolttech, based out of New York. I lead bolttech's customer experience as well as ops excellence and transformation functions. Globally, we operate in about 26 countries in North America, Europe, as well as in Asia. Prior to bolttech, I was leading a strategy team over at AIG, so a lot of insurance experience for about 8 years. And before that, a management consulting background over at Deloitte Consulting, again, working in the strategy and operations space around large Fortune 500 insurance companies. Miranda, I'll turn it over to you.
I think he said Caroline, but I don't want to put order here. Go ahead. Okay, wonderful. Miranda Dikonsky. I am the Chief Customer Officer and Interim Chief Human Resource Officer at a company named Swiftly, where we are a big data platform that powers public transit. A little bit about me. I have been in a customer-facing operations role for over 20 years. Started my career working at much larger organizations that had, 15 to 30,000 plus employees. And about 11 years ago, I pivoted to startups, moved to Silicon Valley area. And since then, I've had or been part of 3 companies that have had equity events. One unicorn IPO, which I'm pretty excited about. And I own generally everything on the customer side, from customer success to customer operations, professional services. I have owned sales, collections, all of that fun stuff as well. Very excited to be here talking to you all.
And I'm Caroline Cathcart. I work at RPIA in Toronto, Ontario. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer here. I own the client experience team, which includes our client operations and our digital marketing, as well as a number of other fun things, including HR and legal. My background is I've had over 20 years in the investment industry in Toronto, starting off on the retail side. Ran a team of about 150 investment advisors across Canada, pivoted to the fund management world, and then where I now work for one of the largest privately owned fixed income managers in Canada. And I'm very excited to be here talking with you guys as well.
All right. Thanks all. So here we are 3 hours and 3 minutes in, and the first time the P word is going to come up, which is the pandemic. We try not to over talk about here, but I think really it impacts this quite a bit. We talk about touch points in that, the pandemic clearly had, well, I'm going to assume it's changed expectations around your touch points. I want to hear more about that. So specifically, what impacts have you seen to both physical and digital touch points as a result of the pandemic?
I'll take that one, Jim. And so, physical touch points, especially for our industry, it's always been a very, physical, personal, in-person, face-to-face industry. And so it really did have a huge impact, mostly on transparency, on those personal relationships. I would have to say it did help us pivot some of our more reluctant clients to a completely digital experience, where they were used to a very in-person experience. We did force those few dinosaurs to a digital one. But more recently, obviously, they're more interested in getting back to a personal relationship. And we've taken the opportunity to sort of leverage that digital experience into feeding them more content, trying to understand their content needs and wishes, so that we can focus the personal and physical relationships more on relationship building and less on content delivery.
Yeah, and I think I'll just quickly add, I as well work with a customer base that maybe they weren't as sophisticated on the digital first side. And we had, customers that had never worked from home before. They didn't have laptops. They didn't have, the ability to work from home. So it was a huge shift for us. And I don't think we're alone, and many others that had to rethink, how do I work with these customers who have to completely shift everything they're doing on the day-to-day? So there was just a lot of change management that we had to help manage as they thought about how they run public transit from home. And granted, this wasn't all transit agencies. I don't want to strike fear into folks, but there were a lot of transit agencies who, were not accustomed to being in a remote first environment. And I think that's not abnormal. And I think it really changed how we all have to think about customer interactions, customer experience, what Carolyn said about, feeding content and things like that. And I think we're better for it now. So I think we can operate very well in both environments.
And Jim, if I can add, from my perspective, bolttech was actually born out of the desire to harness digital capabilities that span the entire spectrum of insurance, right? From distribution to connecting kind of demand and supply with technology. And when the pandemic actually hit, we had to actually think of new ways to further digitize or accelerate that pace of digitization. And one great example is in the claims area. We wanted to avoid too many calls coming into our contact center, for example, because it was putting a heavy load, even with staff kind of working remote and from home. So we deliberately kind of introduced tools like Facebook and Line and WhatsApp, especially in countries in Asia, for example, with a heavy adoption to technology, to get people to actually move and submit claims digitally, as opposed to having to call in to make that claim and take up capacity at our contact centers. So we adapted. I think we were at the right time in our evolution, but had to accelerate that pace of digital adoption as part of our customer journey.
Well, zeroing in a little bit further, Caroline brought up transparency. And we saw this even before the pandemic, that Domino's ruined it for everybody. But when Domino's told you that you can actually find out when your sauce goes on the pizza, nobody knew they needed that. But we're talking to people in insurance, we're talking to people in the most hard-nosed of B2B journeys. We'll have Jen Zamora up here soon from Dow next session, where all their customers are referencing Domino's and saying, I want that for when my chemical supplies are going to be here. I've just posted on the chat a great article from Harvard Business Review on operational transparency. But what I've seen, at least, is that the pandemic accelerated the need for customers to know exactly what's happening and to have more visibility. Now, have you seen that?
I can take that, Jim. And so in our case, what we've noticed is customers are actually demanding more transparency. They're demanding a greater investment from us in data and analytics. They want dashboards. They want real-time data feeds and reports to tell them how their products are not only performing on our platform, but what are some of kind of the buyer and customer sentiments that go with it. So there's a huge demand for data and analytics across our various kind of distribution intermediaries. If I look at my agency channel as an insurance distributor, my agents are hungry for dashboards to know what they've sold, what their renewal pipelines look like, and what their earnings are. And they want all of this real time. They don't have the patience for a month-end report. They want to see it real time. And that's pushing us to kind of, again, focus on data and analytics and providing them with a lot more real-time tools for them to manage their books of business.
It's interesting because, Ryan, I didn't see this shift because what we do is actually provide transparency tools, so that we were selling this pre-COVID. So I didn't see that shift for a demand for more transparency, because that's what we did. And that's what we've done all along, is provide real-time passenger information to the folks that are waiting for the bus, and the on-time performance analytics from behind the scenes, and, you know, speed maps so folks could go look and see what's going on with roads and intersections and things like that. However, I think about human nature, and with us all now being extracted from your day-to-day in society, I have been paying attention to the trends, and there is a huge demand, and you see it through how we shop, how we interact, how we think about our management of our own experiences on the different platforms. You know, if I shop at Amazon, I want to know, is my stuff, where's my stuff on the map, and I can track it where it is on the map. I'm a consumer too, and I think, you know, this is just growing. You know, folks need more. We want more transparency, and we're demanding it. It's kind of fascinating.
So you're one of those customers.
I am definitely 100% one of those customers. There's actually just no reason for companies to not provide this to me as a consumer, right? You know, I'm seeing it done at scale and in mass. And, you know, I've been part of multiple startups now, and there's no reason for us not to bake that into our customer experiences. Because if you think about yourself as a consumer, you want nothing different than what your customers want, right? So there is a huge correlation.
I'll challenge that a little bit. Let's go ahead there.
Okay.
Let's go, but I want to go back to something Ryan had talked about, which is one of the things we found when you're looking at the experience. So I mentioned earlier the conference. Last year we did 150 hours of customer experience. And one of the things we saw is that when somebody was really good at the customer experience, they didn't restrict their measurement to surveys. They were very familiar with the operational behavioral data, which ties into the transparency there. You know, earlier we had a couple folks talking about, we had Percy, HBR talking about, or sorry, from HPE, talking about time to value and looking at that as a measurement. So we look at touch points. How do you provide your inside or your employees inside with that visibility to what's happening? You mentioned dashboards earlier, Ryan. How do you show that visibility to the business data as well as the survey data?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we've spent, even though, you know, we're a startup, we did spend a lot of time upfront building some of that foundational capability. So we did put in a very robust tool to help us with capturing our net promoter score as well as kind of CSAT scores. But then what we did was married that on dashboards with actual operations metrics, right? Performance, around performance, fulfillment times, quality. And when we found that our frontline looked at all these metrics in totality, they were almost able to drill down into root cause and problem solve around issues in real time. So much so that if I did have a fulfillment issue with you know, policies or some of my device protection insurance coverage because of a logistical delay, my net promoter score was almost a lead indicator and that gave me a hint to go back and drill into what was going wrong. I could then very quickly go and fix an operational process or a breakdown and get that score fixed real time in a day or two. So it's been a really powerful tool to frontline employees as well as kind of managerial staff of being able to look at not only kind of traditional customer experience metrics, but operational data and kind of marry the two together.
I love using NPS as a diagnostic as opposed to a score. So great. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No. I was going to say, you know, obviously, I'm sure everybody knows that the pandemic resulted in a huge market dislocation in the financial markets. And so, you know, not that we didn't always track those kind of sales metrics, but the fund flows and the sales metrics became even more important for us from an internal business point of view. And we did, you know, develop reports and dashboards to more closely track that, not only the time to value, but also customer retention, why customers were leaving, where their fund, you know, whether they were switching, where the fund flows actually were going, so that we could more closely address the redemption timelines, shorten that time to value, really pay a lot more attention to those business metrics on an internal point of view. So viewing our business lines as our own clients and feeding them more transparency as well in order to better manage that timeline.
So I disagree with one little thing that was said about NPS. So CSAT is very transactional, right? It's about the experience with the transaction that they had, whether that's talking to your customer support agent or getting a technical issue resolved. That is very much so a lagging indicator. NPS is as well. It's lagging, and it unfortunately just doesn't tell the full picture. Because a lot of people just don't respond to these things, and that's the most dangerous part, is really relying heavily upon a score to be the indicator of future behavior. Now, I'm a huge proponent of NPS. I use it. I use CSAT, but I also tie it into other things like my time to first value measurements, my net retention, my gross renewal. People speak with dollars, right? So I'm always tying all these metrics together. I have a dashboard that I'm regularly looking at. I'm also looking at my monthly active users, how, if folks are achieving ROI on my products. So we're setting goals with, our customers and helping them get a return on their investment, having regular EBRs with them to show them how they're getting a return on their investment, and tying all these metrics together at the bigger level and presenting it to the board and so on and so forth. So I just want to call it out. I think NPS and CSAT and all of that is incredibly important, but NPS, it's more about the trend and less about the number.
And
I agree with you.
More in terms of linking a high NPS to high retention, right? And renewals in our case, where policies renew. I always say there's a problem if the NPS is really high and we don't see a high retention. There's something off there, right? So absolutely, there is a very, very high degree of correlation, and you can put all the effort in the world to improve your customer experience, but if that does not translate into dollars, I think you've lost the plot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And net promoter score does not always translate into dollars. It depends on the industry a lot and the organization. But I want to get to Julia's question in a minute. But Miranda, I want you to explain something you just said, which is I don't hear many people talk about net retention as a metric. I love it. Could you define that for us?
Yeah, net retention, if you look at it on a monthly basis, it's the dollars you started with, and I'm going to botch the actual equation, plus or minus any churn, pretty much. So you're looking at the full picture. Gross is, did you renew what you were supposed to renew? And net is, how much did your revenue expand or contract? So it's a summation of those factors.
And I have to say that's probably one of, it's one of our biggest metrics that we pay attention to, because net retention or net sales is our biggest, is probably our biggest metric that we pay attention to.
Yeah, customer lifetime value is key. So if, the cost of acquisition can be very high depending on your SaaS model. So that's why I pay close attention to that net retention. If I'm not achieving, 105, 110, 120% at the end of the year, it tells me a story about, are my customers buying more? Are they growing with me? And am I able to get back the cost of acquisition? What are all those ratios? So those are things that I watch very closely.
If I had to explain a little bit more, and see if you agree with the definition. I've seen it defined a little bit differently. If I had 100 customers, each ordering $50 worth, easy math. So that's $5,000. If I lose 10 customers, then that becomes 90%. Because it's not as much. Or if I lose 90, but they each buy twice as much, well then it's 180%. But it's not just how many customers I keep, but how much are they each spending with me.
Exactly. And I also, it's important to call out, I watch gross as well, because if you have, 95% of the dollars that are up for renewal that renew, and then that 95 customers, or 95% of that revenue buys more, it's great. But if you lose and you're down to 50% of the customers ended up renewing, even if they purchase 3x more, you still have a leaky bucket, right? So you want to see what you're doing and figure out how you retain everyone that's in that bucket, or how you learn from that and teach work with marketing to make sure they're bringing in the right customers, work with sales to make sure that they're making sure the value prop is very strong on your product, right? Those numbers can teach everyone in the organization more about the customer base, more about the experience, more about the desired outcomes, return on investment, everything if you're digging into it at all the levels.
Jim,
the other webinar. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
The other thing we've also been trying with is how do you optimize the customer journey to ultimately upsell and cross-sell, right? Customers. So as they finish the purchase journey on one product, how do you use some of the rich data and analytics you have at the back end to suggest alternate products, especially in the insurance space, right? If I'm buying a single travel policy and I ask you a couple of questions to see whether you make more than 3 or 4 trips a year, I then suggest, why don't you buy an annual policy, because you're not only going to save as opposed to buying individual travel policies, but then I hook you on as a customer on an annual policy, which gives me the chance to then sell you a renewal on renewal. So, very often you can use a lot of this rich data around the customer journey and the data that you collect at the back end to upsell, cross-sell, and it leads back to Miranda's point of retention, right? Of creating that mousetrap to sell more and take the customer up that value chain.
Ryan, are you suggesting that you customer experience people can be concerned about selling? Isn't that blasphemy?
I mean, everybody in the organization should be selling. Let's be real. If we don't have revenue, we don't have a company. However, there does need to be a balance, right?
Exactly.
And so that's, we did a webinar a few months ago with Nancy Flowers at Hagerty. And if you're not familiar with Hagerty, they're a car enthusiast company, insurance, one of their products. And she learned that if she started conversations with executives about Net Promoter Score, their eyes would glaze over. But if she started with retention, started with upsells, and then used the Net Promoter Score, other things to explain it, she got a lot more buy-in. Have you found that?
I mean, my board cares about the NPS. They like to see the trend line on the NPS. But what they really seem to care about is the dollars, the net retention, the gross, all of that. I guess it depends on, I don't ever like to blanket, make a blanket statement about execs. I'm a customer exec and I care a lot about the sentiment metrics, but I also want to make sure we have solid business metrics.
I would have to say for us, both are equally important because the retention and the sales metrics are incredibly important. But to Ryan's point, if we don't understand our clients and how they're feeling about that journey, we're not going to have opportunities to cross-sell, which is equally important. So I would have to agree, like they're both equally important to us.
So you've talked a lot about tracking that, optimizing the journey, tracking the journey, getting there. Now, typically, Net Promoter Score, as example, or customer sat are used one of two ways, either as a relationship metric overall or at a specific transaction. There are some companies that use journey surveys, but not very many. It's not a really adopted practice out there. How do you measure the health of the customer journey?
So I can start. So in addition to your point of some of these metrics, we also look at kind of drop-off rates through the funnel. And try to get to the root cause as to what's causing the drop-off. In addition to that, we do actually go back to customers who've dropped off and very often conduct kind of surveys, customer surveys, as well as kind of market research around what's causing it. Again, being in the insurtech space, we're really experimenting a lot. We spend a lot of time doing customer interviews, agent interviews, because that's one of our intermediary channels, as well as kind of, I'll call it qualitative and quantitative market research to get a better understanding for what's causing the drop off or what's working versus what's not working, so we can do more of what's working well and avoid some of the pitfalls which you would otherwise not think about if you don't have a very customer-centric view. One thing we have tried in some of our markets also is mystery shopping, where we send a couple of people in to test our processes, especially around the claims journey. And it's been super insightful. Very often people don't understand the product, which means we've got to go back and invest a lot more in educating our customers on the product and the benefit. And there are some really good insights that come into it, which help us not only refine the product itself and the offering, but the education that goes with the product.
I would have to say we do a lot of customer interviews all the way along the journey, and especially I would say more with larger customers when they do drop off, to find out exactly what the reason is, because it's in the investment space. A lot of times it doesn't have anything to do directly with us. They're optimizing another opportunity, but in some cases, it is something that we can address on the client journey and the client experience. But it certainly is a lot of interviews throughout the whole process.
I'm operating in a very different business model than Ryan and Caroline. So I have a team of individuals that actively manage these relationships, and they have guidelines and touch points that they have to have along the way. So they're talking to every customer almost at minimum once a month. And these are generally like the key stakeholders of the contract. And also our customers pay for their contract up front. So it's, yes, we do monitor the sentiment along the journey. We have a customer success tool that we use where they have to put in pulse points at every juncture, and I monitor those heavily on the aggregate to see how the pulse is trending, but we don't do customer journey surveying. I think, just having that much contact with them in general is like, I think a survey would probably be overkill on top of that. So I think the important takeaway is to make sure that you're looking at the customer experience and not overkilling the surveys or how you're extracting sentiment from your customers.
And when some of our large B2B customers actually do have what we have a role called the customer success manager, who's assigned to a couple of large accounts, and they're the ones who really have a pulse on how these relationships are working. We have a bi-weekly review of the account, trying to figure out what are the friction points and what are things we need to work on. And they're really the voice and the conduit into the customer to really get a day-to-day understanding of what we need to work on or improve on.
Yep, that's very similar to my business model.
To clarify, I wouldn't say we use a lot of surveys, because we found, again, that only the ones who have something positive to say come back and say anything, which doesn't help us. But our client relationships are managed both by the initial salesperson and by a client relationship manager, depending on the size, also by senior executives. So there are a lot of touch points they have all along the way, which is, the biggest way that we monitor that client sentiment as well, and not so much in surveys. We've tried them and we found they were really good for reinforcing positive feedback that we already had.
Everybody's like, look at how great we are.
I'm really glad to hear all three of you talk about customer interviews, because when we were doing these interviews, we noticed something, that a lot of the people we talked to in customer experience never actually talked to customers. And so I put a post out there called The Myth of the Customer Focused Leader, because a lot of them are spending all the time in surveys. So I'm glad to hear you say that you are interviewing customers, but I have to apologize to Julia, because I said about 15 minutes ago I was going to go right to her question and didn't do it. So I'm going to get to Julia's first question, which is, Caroline, it's for you. You mentioned gently forcing the dinosaurs, in quotes, to adapt and to adopt digital. How is that achieved without losing the customer altogether?
Well, so it was fortuitous that the pandemic came along and we weren't able to do any more face-to-face meetings, whether it was for picking up a check or getting something signed or getting their documents. And so we had implemented fully digital client onboarding and investment processes about 2 years before the pandemic. So for the majority of our clients, it wasn't a big difference. And we tried to drive them to the portal for all of their information. But with the pandemic coming along, it made it just that much easier to say, nope, I'm sorry, we can't come by and have you sign the documents. You're going to have to go digital. We have to do it because we just can't. And so it was a nice, gentle stick to you for those dinosaurs, because we really, our hands were tied. We couldn't deal with them the way we had historically been dealing with them, and they were just forced by the circumstances. And because everybody was becoming more used to digital, there was just a very smooth path, and now they're not going back and asking for, that we're still doing in person again now that we can, but they've sort of moved onto that digital platform for all of the delivery of the content. So it was a little bit fortuitous.
And I know that question is for Carolyn, and we're almost out of time, but I think the biggest thing is change management on this, making sure that you're providing various resources on how to, to help the dinosaurs move along, whether that be little videos that show them how to do things, or articles or infographics, whatever it may be, like just double down on education, and that helps a lot.
Yeah, I would echo that, because that was one thing we implemented, was we have multiple ways of showing them how to access things, both from, phone calls, touch points, in PDF instructions, videos, everything that they could possibly have imaginable as to how to walk them through the portal and our dashboards and accessing their documents.
Great. I wish this person had their name attached to it, because it's a question I'm really passionate about, because I think 3 or 4 years from now, you will all say yes, but I'm interested in any of you will say yes today, which is, have any of you leveraged customer journey orchestration and analytics platforms to manage customer journeys?
No.
It's more of a B2C thing, but I'm just wondering if any of you have done that.
No. Even when I worked in B2C, I didn't. I've worked at Lending Club, I've worked at HelloSign. We did not, no.
Okay. Again, I think 3 to 5 years from now, especially in B2C, it's going to become very common, but it's still early days, but it's a fantastic capability. I don't want to take the time for the panel here, but if you're not familiar with it, research it. So Ryan, a question for you. Can you provide examples of some of the changes you implemented because of your customer interviews?
So we made quite a bit of changes to some of our initial UI UX designs. When we initially launched some of our digital products on our insurance exchange platform, to the design team, we thought we had a very easy, simple to use and interactive product. But when we did a lot of these focus groups, a lot of folks are moving and adopting to digital technologies and are now purchasing in travel insurance and various other insurance products on their cell phones. So they want a very, very easy and smooth experience. So you could have optimized it for a desktop computer, but as more and more people now kind of move to mobile technologies, you realize that your design, your UI, UX, and your customer journey has to be a lot more smoother, cleaner, with fewer fields to be filled in. Otherwise, you see a huge amount of drop off as part of that customer journey. So using a lot of this data, we were able to almost streamline the amount of data we collected as part of the customer interview to generate a quote, and then made that point from the quote issuance all the way to collection of premium to the policy issuance very, very seamless. So that you minimize the amount of clicks and screens that the customer has got to go to, and also leverage a lot of the third-party data that's available to you. So we experimented and were able to cut down, I think, a good 20 or 30% of the questions that were asked through the journey, as well as streamline things as simple as a font size or the color of a font and how it contrasts on a phone or a mobile device versus a desktop. And there were some fascinating learnings that came out of those face-to-face interviews that we did with various customers in key markets.
And so following up on that, Katie asked, would you collect customer feedback through interviews or touch points, that is non-surveys? How and where do you store that data? For example, do your reps enter this into the system manually when text analytics can be done? How do you ensure this is done?
So we capture it in various forms. So sometimes we do it internally through our own internal research capabilities. Sometimes we do tie up with a vendor who has access to focus groups and various, I'll call it ecosystems for us to tap into to conduct these interviews. But a lot of what we collect is recorded in internal kind of reports, which ultimately feeds our product design and then influences our roadmap. So we're built on a very agile approach and methodology. So to use an agile term, it feeds as input into a future sprint as just new features we want to add on to it.
How about the rest of you? Miranda, Caroline, where are you storing all this? Because you both talked about interviews.
Yeah, so The monthly touch points, well, if you are an enterprise level customer, you generally talk with your customer success manager twice a month. The information is either stored directly in our customer success tool in a pulse, and then that pulse actually feeds into a public Slack channel that the entire company is in, so they can read exactly what's going on, feedback, all of that. We also have customer advisory boards that we hold where we aggregate feedback, and that's also done in either Jira or the customer success tool. So we're not we're a Series B tech startup with 100 team members, so we're not very sophisticated yet in this. But where we do aggregate is generally those two tools, or I'm going to blow your mind, we run a lot of our company on Google Sheets. So we use Google Sheets a lot to aggregate data as well.
For us, it's stored in an internal platform that we generate reports from. Meetings are all tracked. Meetings, calls, any events are all tracked so that we can have reports on last meeting, last point of contact with notes attached to them, so we can export all of that information so we can see across the whole organization the most recent contact and notes for each client and each relationship.
And Jim, just to add to that, especially around customer experience, if we do get a negative score, we do sometimes follow it up with a phone call, and we do have that closed loop tracking. So we do use our tool. So we use Qualtrics as our tool to measure customer experience. We do use the closed loop tracking, facility and functionality to capture kind of how we resolve the issue, so that kind of we learn from it and make sure we don't have that pop up again in the future.
Ryan, I love hearing you say that. That is definitely one of my core things, is if we get, of course, negative CSAT or a negative NPS, or even a passive NPS, it immediately creates a ticket in Zendesk. And that needs to be followed up on, like, what can we do to get you to a promoter score, or what do we need to do to change this experience? I find a lot of folks don't realize if they give you a 7 or an 8, they're not really giving you a B. They're a passive on the NPS scale. So you want to know how you can get them to a 9 or a 10. And I think that loop, that closed loop system, Ryan, is so crucial that a lot of folks in customer experience, they forget about it. They get the scores and they're like, well, we have 20 detractors, but look at this, we have 500 promoters. But you know what, you have to follow up on those 20 detractors. Those are data points that you want to dig in and double click on to figure out why are they detractors and what can you do to change that experience.
Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, I mean, some of the detractors, to be honest, it was more around product knowledge, something as simple as, we just needed to educate them a little more on the product and the features, which they didn't understand. So, small things like that come up through these interviews, which are really helpful in refining the product and our future roadmap.
Yeah, I think one other thing that customer experience professionals could do is, if you have a major release, I know like sales, for example, they just do a couple of releases a year, try releasing your NPS shortly thereafter. Because you'll get all the feedback you want from all your loyal fans. They're going to let you know if you survey them and your release changed too much of how they need to use your product in order to be successful.
Randy, just you sparked something, and which is something I've seen with a lot of companies, is they're really good at collecting the data, not so good at sharing what they did. And as a result, of course, response rates go down because I'm just going into a void. Even if you're doing a lot of work, how do you tie it back to your customers? This is something especially B2B to show, hey, thanks for feedback. This is what we did.
Feedback is one of our core values at Swiftly, and we actually talk about this a lot in EBR. So when we receive feedback from a particular customer, it becomes part of the EBR. We show them, you've given us feedback on these 5 features, and this is what we've done. And if we can't do anything with that feedback, we let them know as well. We don't want to leave folks hanging with the forever hope that their desire to turn your platform from a dark blue to a hot pink is going to happen, right? Because you do get a lot of feedback. So it's important to take that feedback in and figure out what you're going to be able to do or not do, and then close that loop. But we talk about it a lot in EBRs. We show all the different functionalities that we have put out based on feedback we've received, not just from them, but from other customers as well. So they can see that our product is feedback driven. It is, we take that and make decisions based on what's going on, in the market and in the industry and what they're needing. And we marry that together to get our product roadmap out.
And EBR?
Sorry, executive business review. So we don't do quarterly business reviews. We do executive business reviews. So we have the executives of the customers come and we talk to them about ROI, feedback, product roadmap, goals, all of that twice a year.
Thanks.
And Jim, what we do is we try to push a lot of our dashboards around, like I said, operational metrics as well as kind of customer metrics over to our frontline managers who see it on a daily basis. So there's a daily report, for example, that goes out at 9 o'clock local time to, giving them their performance metrics for the previous day. And then the ops managers get the same. And then on a weekly basis, the executives get a report out as well of the performance of each and every business unit. And that's really useful for especially our frontline managers who are getting this data on a daily basis to start reacting. They even get a sentiment map to see what are some of the key words that customers are telling us, both positive and negative. And it's amazing that, when you make the system transparent, to your point earlier, feedback is a gift if it's used correctly. And we try to kind of make sure our frontline kind of has access to the feedback coming from our customers, whether it's positive or if it's developmental that we need to work on.
So Ryan, Julia had a follow-up question is, how do you do, in quotes, the mystery shopping? Is it outsourced to third party? Is it selected customers you already have? Is it employees?
No, so we actually, the last 2 rounds that we did, we actually outsourced it to a third party research firm. We gave them the criteria of what we were looking for, and then they recruited a mix of customers who had bought our product in the past, as well as products from competitors, so that we could kind of compare and contrast the claims experience.
Okay. And a follow-up on the Journey Analytics Orchestration question, which is, can you please share more why you haven't used the Customer Journey Orchestration Analytics platform? Do you think they're overrated, just not mature enough, something you'd reconsider in the future?
I may reconsider it, but here's the reality. I notice a lot of companies spend a lot of time doing journey mapping, and it's the journey they want their customers to take, and they don't usually incorporate the voice of the customer in that journey. In most instances, your customers are going to take the journey that they want, not the journey that you want for them. So I've not been heavily brought into doing these activities, because after you do them, if you're not or during creation, if you're not incorporating the voice of the customer in that, it's just literally a piece of paper or a diagram that you've created that goes stale and stagnant. That's been my experience.
So
I have to agree with Miranda.
And Jim, we had less than 18 months. So I think there was some more fundamental capabilities to be put in before we could kind of pivot to something more mature. But it's definitely something we will look at in the future. But we had to build some foundational capabilities as we married it to the geographical expansion that we took on.
For those perhaps not familiar with Journey Analytics Orchestration, this is a platform that will first of all listen to what is happening in your journey through the data, suggest a next best action, as well as build interventions. So for example, one of the common examples would be onboarding for a bank. And so if they've gone to the app but they haven't filled out the data, it sends reminders, and you can say, let's send a text, let's send an in-app message after 3 days. Let's say somebody called them. Oh, this is a high value client. Let's instead have the relationship manager of the bank call them. But that's why I say 3 to 5 years from now, I think it'll be common. Right now, a lot of organizations don't have the data in place. And also a lot of B2B organizations don't have the number of customers to make such a thing financially feasible. But I do think as the prices come down, as the data, a lot of organizations right now as part of digital transformation are working to get the data in more of a standard spot. And I do believe this will be something we're having more conversations in the future. The number of cases so far are in the relatively, I don't know, maybe 100, 150 organizations is pure guess. but it's early days, but it is something I do encourage people to look at. There were purchases of 2 of the platforms in this last summer. So it seems to be that's incorporating. Qualtrics bought UserMind, and I can't remember who bought Kitewheel. But there is space, a lot of work happening here. And so it's something I would start learning about if I was a CX professional or a vendor. I would learn about that too. Now, if like me, you were offended by the description of a journey map is a piece of paper, we'll be talking about that coming next with a couple of people coming up here. But I want to say, Miranda, come on.
I just feel like they're usually lacking in the voice of customer. That's all.
Then it's not a customer journey map. You're right. If you're doing it through employees, it's not a customer journey map. But yes, we'll go into that next. So Miranda, Caroline, Ryan, thank you so much. I mean, you gave fantastic transparency to your organizations, the decision making you do, and how you collect the data. So thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
All right. Bye.